It was one of those evenings when the city seemed alive in every direction. Cars passed by with their lights flashing through the hotel windows. People laughed softly over dinner, and the piano in the corner sat silent, shining under the golden chandelier. The luxury hotel restaurant was full of movement and voices, yet for one girl, it was just another long shift that she needed to get through. She had been working at the hotel for almost 2 years now, moving from table to table with quiet grace. She didn't talk much, didn't try to make friends, and hardly ever looked up unless it was necessary. Her focus stayed on her work, refilling glasses, serving plates, and keeping her smile polite but small. She didn't like attention. Most guests barely noticed her anyway, and she was used to that. But behind that quiet face was someone who carried a story. Before working here, she had dreams. She once believed she would spend her life surrounded by music. Her mother had taught her to play the piano when she was a little girl, back when life still felt soft and kind. They used to sit together for hours, her mother's hands guiding hers gently over the keys. Each note had felt like magic. But dreams fade fast when life turns hard. After losing her mother and then facing financial struggles, music became a luxury she could no longer afford. Now, instead of playing, she served those who could pay for private concerts and fine dinners. Yet sometimes, when she passed by the piano in the restaurant's corner, she couldn't help glancing at it for a brief moment, wondering what it would feel like to touch the keys again. She always brushed the thought away and continued her work, because dreams don't pay rent and memories don't feed you. That evening, the hotel staff was preparing for a special event. A famous businessman, a billionaire known for his success and his sharp tongue, had booked the private dining area for his close circle of friends and investors. The entire staff knew what that meant. Everything had to be perfect. The man was known for his arrogance and his habit of testing people just for his own amusement. Everyone walked on eggshells around him, hoping not to make the slightest mistake. The girl adjusted her apron and joined the rest of the team as the guests started arriving. Expensive suits, diamond watches, and loud laughter filled the air. The billionaire sat at the center of the table, confident and commanding, every word he said followed by polite chuckles from those around him. He liked being the star of the room, and nobody dared to challenge that. She served quietly, keeping her movements smooth and her head slightly bowed. As she poured wine into a glass near the billionaire, he suddenly looked at her with a curious expression. "You're very quiet," he said, his tone playful but sharp. "Do you ever smile?" She gave a small, polite smile, unsure of what to say. "Just doing my job, sir," she replied softly. He chuckled, glancing at his friends. "Ah, doing her job," he repeated mockingly. "Such a serious worker. Tell me, do you do anything fun at all? Or are you one of those people who never learned how to enjoy life?" His friends laughed, clearly trying to stay on his good side. She stood still, trying not to show discomfort. "I enjoy music," she said quietly. "Music?" He raised a brow. "What kind of music?" "Mostly piano," she replied. The billionaire smirked, glancing toward the piano in the corner of the hall. "Oh, you play?" She nodded slowly. "I used to." The grin on his face widened. "Used to? Well, why don't you remind us?" "Come on," he said, gesturing toward the piano. "Play something. Let's see if you can actually make that old thing come alive." The room went silent for a moment. Everyone stared at her. Some of the guests looked awkward, others amused. It was clear to everyone what was happening. He wasn't really interested in hearing her play. He just wanted to make her uncomfortable, to turn her into entertainment for his table. "I can't, sir," she said softly. "It wouldn't be appropriate while I'm working." "Oh, nonsense," he said loudly. "We're all friends here. A little music won't hurt anyone. You said you play piano, right? Then prove it. Unless you were exaggerating." Laughter filled the room again, and her cheeks grew warm. She looked down, feeling small, wishing she could just disappear. But something inside her, maybe pride, maybe the memory of her mother, whispered that walking away would only make it worse. So she took a breath, straightened her back, and said quietly, "If you insist." The laughter faded. No one had expected her to agree. Even the billionaire seemed slightly surprised. But he leaned back in his chair, amused. "By all means," he said with a smirk. "Show us what you've got." Her heart pounded as she walked slowly toward the piano. Each step felt heavier than the last. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room following her. When she finally reached the instrument, her hands trembled slightly. It had been years since she last touched real piano keys. She sat down on the bench and took a deep breath. For a moment, she just looked at the keys, her reflection faintly visible on the polished surface. She could almost hear her mother's voice again, whispering, "Don't think, just feel the music." She closed her eyes and placed her fingers gently on the keys. The first few notes came out soft and uncertain, but then as her hands began to move, the room seemed to fade away. The nervousness in her chest slowly turned into calm. Her fingers remembered what her mind had forgotten. The melody grew stronger, smoother, more emotional. The guests stopped whispering. Even the billionaire, who had been leaning back with a smirk, leaned forward, his smile fading. The soft sound of the piano filled the room, not just with music, but with feeling, sadness, longing, beauty. It was the kind of sound that reached places words couldn't. She played not to impress them, but because she needed to. Each note carried a piece of her past. Her mother's laughter, their tiny home, the late nights of practicing under a flickering lamp. The pain of losing all of that. The years of silence. It was all there, woven into the melody. The people who had been laughing minutes ago now sat frozen, eyes fixed on her. No one dared speak or even move. The music seemed to touch something deep inside them, something they didn't expect to feel during a dinner party. When the song finally ended, her hand stayed still on the keys. The last note echoed through the hall, slowly fading into silence. For a long moment, nobody made a sound. Then softly at first, someone clapped. Then another. And soon the entire room was filled with applause. The girl stood up quietly, her face calm though her heart was still racing. She gave a small nod and turned back toward the tables. The billionaire didn't clap. He just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Finally, he said in a low voice, "Where did you learn to play like that?" She looked at him, her eyes steady. "My mother taught me," she said simply. He didn't reply. For once, the man who always had something clever to say was speechless. She walked back to her place behind the serving station, her hands still slightly trembling. Not from fear this time, but from release. She had expected humiliation. Instead, she had found strength she didn't know she still had. The rest of the evening passed quietly. Conversations resumed, though they lacked their earlier cheer. The billionaire hardly spoke again. He just sat there, lost in thought, occasionally glancing toward the piano. When the dinner finally ended and the guests began to leave, he walked past her without saying a word. For a second their eyes met, and she could see something had shifted in his face, maybe respect, maybe guilt. But she didn't need his apology. As the restaurant emptied and the lights dimmed, she stayed back to help clean up. When she passed by the piano again, she paused and touched the keys gently with one finger. A small smile appeared on her face. That night, as she walked home through the quiet streets, she realized something had changed. For the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. She didn't have money, power, or fame, but she had something more meaningful. She had her music again. And somewhere in that hotel, a billionaire sat alone, remembering how a girl he tried to humiliate had played a melody that stripped away his pride and left him speechless. The next morning came quietly, with a soft breeze pushing through the half-open window of her small apartment. The sun had barely risen, and the streets outside still looked sleepy. She sat at the edge of her bed, staring at her uniform hanging neatly by the door. It was supposed to be just another day at work, but something inside her felt different. She couldn't stop thinking about the night before, the piano, the music, and the silence that had followed her last note. It wasn't the applause she remembered most. It was the look on everyone's faces, and especially his. The billionaire's expression had shifted from amusement to something deeper, something he probably didn't even understand himself. She had gone home quietly after her shift, but that image had stayed in her mind all night. She took a deep breath and got ready for work. Life didn't pause for emotional moments, not in her world. Rent was still due, bills were still waiting. So she pushed her hair back, tied her apron around her waist, and walked to the hotel like always. When she arrived, she noticed whispers among her coworkers. The manager was standing near the counter, speaking quietly to another staff member. They stopped talking when she walked in, giving her curious looks. "What's going on?" she asked softly. The other waitress smiled, her eyes wide. "You, Don't know? Everyone's talking about you. The guests from last night, they couldn't stop mentioning how you played the piano. Even the manager got calls this morning. She froze for a moment, unsure how to react. Calls? About me? The waitress nodded excitedly. Yeah. Apparently some of those rich people recorded your performance. One video is already making rounds online. The hotel's name is all over it, and they're saying it was the most beautiful performance they've heard in years. Her heart skipped a beat. She had never imagined something like that could happen. The piano had been just a moment, one emotional release, and not something meant to spread beyond that room. Before she could ask more, the manager called her into his office. He was a polite man, always focused on professionalism. But today, his tone was softer than usual. I heard what happened last night, he said, gesturing for her to sit. You handled yourself well. I know that situation could have gone wrong, but you turned it into something special. Even the guests who didn't clap said they'd never forget it. Thank you, sir, she said quietly, folding her hands on her lap. He smiled slightly. You might want to prepare yourself. The man who hosted that dinner, the billionaire, he left a note for you. Her eyes widened. For me? He handed her a small folded card. The handwriting was neat and formal. It simply said, "Meet me in the lounge this evening. I owe you a proper conversation." Her first thought was confusion. Why would he want to see her again? Last night she had been just a servant to him. Now suddenly he wanted to talk? The idea made her nervous, but also a little curious. She didn't know if she wanted to face him, yet something told her she should. The day went by slowly. She tried to stay focused on her work, but her thoughts kept circling back to that note. When evening arrived, she took off her apron and fixed her hair. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she decided she would go. Not out of fear, but out of self-respect. The hotel lounge was quiet, dimly lit, with soft music playing in the background. He was already there, sitting near the window, dressed in a dark suit. For the first time, he looked less like the man who had laughed at her and more like someone deep in thought. When he saw her, he stood up immediately. You came, he said. His tone was different, gentler, sincere. Yes, she replied, keeping her voice calm. You asked to meet. He nodded slowly, motioning for her to sit. For a moment he didn't speak. He just looked at her as if searching for the right words. Finally he said, I owe you an apology. She stayed silent, waiting. What I did last night was wrong, he continued. I thought I was being clever. I thought it would be amusing to put you on the spot. I didn't expect that. He paused, his eyes lowering to the table. You made me realize how small I looked trying to make someone else feel small. You played with a kind of honesty I haven't seen in years. She didn't know what to say. No one had ever spoken to her like that, especially not someone like him. I didn't play to prove anything, she said softly. I just played because it was something I missed. I didn't want to embarrass anyone. He smiled faintly. You didn't embarrass me. You humbled me. That's worse and better. For a moment they both laughed quietly. The tension eased a little. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. You know, I've heard hundreds of performances in my life. I've hired musicians for events, bought pianos worth more than cars, but I've never heard anyone play like you did last night. You didn't just play notes. You told a story. She looked down, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of the table. Music was the only thing my mother left me. I guess I just remembered her while I played. He nodded slowly. That's what made it real. They sat in silence for a few seconds. The clinking of glasses and the soft jazz music filled the space between them. Finally, he said, I want to do something for you. You deserve better than waiting tables. Her eyes widened slightly. I don't need anything, sir. He shook his head. Don't refuse yet, just hear me out. I have connections in the music world, people who would want to meet someone like you. If you're willing, I can arrange for you to audition for a scholarship at a conservatory. No strings attached." She stared at him, trying to process what he had just said. "Why would you do that for me?" He looked at her directly. "Because sometimes people like me forget that real talent, real emotion, can't be bought. You reminded me of that. I want to make it right." She hesitated. It sounded unreal, too generous, too sudden. Part of her wanted to believe him, but another part warned her not to trust too easily. She had learned the hard way that the world rarely gave second chances without expecting something in return. "I appreciate the offer," she said quietly, "but I'm not sure I belong in that world anymore." He leaned forward slightly. "You belong wherever your heart leads you. Don't let money or fear decide that for you." His words lingered in the air, soft but firm. She didn't answer. She just nodded slowly, unsure of what to feel. After a few minutes, he stood up. "I'll leave my assistant's card at the reception. If you ever change your mind, call. No pressure." She stood as well. "Thank you," she said sincerely. He smiled faintly and walked away, leaving her standing by the window, her reflection shimmering against the glass. For a long time, she stayed there, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The next few days passed quietly, but her mind wouldn't settle. She kept thinking about his words. Each time she walked past the piano in the restaurant, she felt the same pull inside her, that longing she had tried so hard to bury. One night, when her shift ended and the restaurant was empty, she sat down at the piano again. The lights were low, the room silent. She closed her eyes and began to play softly. The music was simple, tender, just for her. She didn't hear the footsteps at first, but when she looked up, she saw the hotel manager standing by the door, smiling. "The Billionaire's assistant called today," he said. "They really mean what they offered. The scholarship is real. They're waiting for your answer." Her fingers froze on the keys. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The opportunity sounded too big, too far from the life she knew. That night, as she walked home, she thought about her mother again. How she used to say that music was a language the soul understood better than words. Maybe this was her second chance, a chance her mother would have wanted her to take. The city lights glowed softly above her as she made her decision. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew one thing for sure. The girl who once played piano just to survive had finally found the courage to play for herself again. And somewhere across the city, the billionaire sat by his window listening to a recording of her performance from that night. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about business or money. He was thinking about how a single melody, played by a girl he'd tried to humiliate, had changed the way he saw the world. Days passed, but the thought of the scholarship offer never left her mind. Each time she tried to focus on her daily routine, something inside her whispered that maybe this was the chance she had been waiting for. The one thing that could change everything. Yet every time that hope appeared, doubt followed right behind it. She wasn't used to expecting good things. Life had taught her to stay careful, to not dream too big. Dreams often led to disappointment. Still, when she looked at the piano in the hotel every night, the thought returned stronger than before. One evening, after her shift, she found herself standing near the reception desk, staring at the small card the billionaire's assistant had left behind. It had been sitting there for days untouched, waiting for her to decide. The manager saw her standing there and quietly said, "You should call them. Even if it's just to ask questions, you don't lose anything by trying." She looked at him, hesitating. "What if I'm not good enough?" He smiled gently. "You already proved that you are. You just need to believe it." Those words stayed with her as she walked home through the quiet streets. When she reached her apartment, she sat down by the window and held the card in her hands. The city lights reflected off the printed number. Her heart beat faster. Finally, she picked up her old phone, took a deep breath, and dialed. A woman's voice answered politely, introducing herself as the billionaire's assistant. She spoke warmly, as if she had been expecting the call. "He told me you might reach out," she said kindly. "We're arranging auditions for a few scholarship candidates next week. Would you like to be added to the list?" Her hands trembled slightly as she replied, "Yes, I'd like that." The woman gave her the details, date, time, and place. It was scheduled at a prestigious music conservatory in the city, a place she had only ever seen from the outside. When the call ended, she sat there for a long moment, staring at the phone, unable to believe she had actually said yes. The following week felt both long and short at the same time. Between her shifts at the hotel and her preparations for the audition, she barely had time to rest. She practiced whenever she could, early mornings, late nights, sometimes sneaking into the restaurant after closing, just to sit at the piano for an hour. At first, her fingers were stiff, but as the days went by, the music started to flow again. She chose a piece that reminded her of her mother, emotional but simple, the kind of music that told a story instead of showing off skill. Every time she played it, she could almost feel her mother's presence beside her. Her coworkers noticed how focused she had become. Some of them started leaving little notes of encouragement on her locker. Small things like, "You'll do great," or "We're all cheering for you." Those gestures made her smile. For once, she didn't feel alone. When the day of the audition arrived, she woke up early. Her stomach felt tight and her hands were cold. She didn't have fancy clothes, so she wore a simple white blouse and black skirt, neatly ironed. She tied her hair back and looked at herself in the mirror. For a moment, she didn't see the tired waitress she had been for years. She saw the girl who used to dream. The conservatory was even more beautiful up close. Its tall glass windows reflected the morning sunlight, and the sound of faint music echoed through the halls. She felt small walking among people who looked so confident, young men and women carrying sheet music, teachers greeting students with familiarity. At the registration desk, a woman handed her a form and said, "You're here for the scholarship audition, correct?" "Yes," she replied quietly. After filling in her details, she waited in a long corridor outside the performance hall. Through the door, she could hear faint melodies as other candidates took their turns. Each one sounded perfect, polished, professional. Her heart began to race faster with each performance she heard. When her name was finally called, she took a deep breath and stepped into the hall. The room was large and quiet, with a grand piano in the center and a small panel of judges sitting a few feet away. To her surprise, one of the people sitting among them was the billionaire himself. He gave her a small nod when their eyes met, but said nothing. The gesture calmed her more than she expected. "Please begin whenever you're ready," one of the judges said. She sat down at the piano, closed her eyes for a second, and let the noise in her head fade. Then she began to play. The first few notes came out gentle, trembling slightly, but soon her fingers found their rhythm. The melody filled the room, rising and falling like waves. It wasn't perfect, a few notes slipped, but there was honesty in her playing, something raw that came straight from her heart. The judges watched quietly. The billionaire sat motionless, his gaze fixed on her hands as they moved gracefully over the keys. By the time the final note faded into silence, her eyes were wet. She didn't mean to cry, but she couldn't help it. The room stayed still for a moment before the judges exchanged quiet glances. One of them leaned forward and said softly, "That was beautiful." She stood up slowly and bowed her head. "Thank you," she whispered. "You can step outside now," another judge said kindly. "We'll contact you with the results." She nodded, walked out of the room, and took a deep breath once she was in the corridor again. The tension in her chest finally eased. Whatever happened next, she knew she had given everything she had. Outside the hall, she sat on a bench and stared at her hands. The billionaire stepped out a few minutes later. When he saw her, he walked over and said, "You did well." She smiled faintly. "Thank you. I made a few mistakes," he shook his head. No one noticed. "What they'll remember is how you made them feel." She looked at him curiously.
"Why did you come here?"
He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Because I wanted to see what you'd do when the world wasn't watching to laugh, but to listen." She didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded. A few days later, while she was at work, her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. She stepped into the storage room and answered. It was the conservatory representative. "We're pleased to inform you that you've been selected for the scholarship program," the voice said. "Classes begin next month." Her knees almost gave out. She pressed her hand to her chest, struggling to hold back tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." When she hung up, she sat down on a crate, her heart racing. It didn't feel real. After years of silence, after giving up on everything she loved, she was finally getting another chance. That evening, she found herself once again at the piano in the empty restaurant. The lights were dim and the world outside was quiet. She placed her fingers on the keys and began to play softly. A new melody, one filled with hope. The billionaire arrived unexpectedly, walking in through the open door. He stood quietly listening. When she noticed him, she stopped playing, but he shook his head gently. "Don't stop," he said. She smiled slightly and continued. When she finished, he said, "You're going to do great things. I can already tell." She looked down at the keys. "I don't know what will happen next, but I'm not afraid anymore." He smiled faintly. "Good. That's how you know you're ready." For the first time, she believed it too. In the days that followed, she began preparing for her new life. She worked her last few shifts at the hotel, saying goodbye to her coworkers who had become like family. They threw her a small farewell party in the staff room, complete with a cake and laughter that echoed through the kitchen. On her final night, she sat alone at the piano one last time. Her reflection shone faintly in the black surface, just like it had the night everything began. She thought about her mother, the challenges, the humiliation that had unexpectedly turned into opportunity, and she smiled. She didn't know where the path would lead, but she was no longer the same girl who once feared being seen. She had faced her worst moment and turned it into her beginning. As she stood to leave, she ran her hand gently across the piano. The same instrument that had once embarrassed her had now given her a new life. And somewhere far away, the billionaire sat in his quiet office watching a new video that had surfaced online, her audition recording. For a long time, he didn't say a word. Then softly he whispered, "She reminded me of what real greatness looks like." He leaned back, closed his eyes, and smiled and humbled once again, not by power, but by the simple truth that sometimes the smallest voices carry the loudest music. The morning she started at the conservatory felt like a dream. The city was still half asleep, the air crisp and cool as she stood at the gates of the tall glass building that looked more like a museum than a school. She clutched her small bag close to her side, nervous but excited. For the first time in years, she wasn't walking to the hotel or the restaurant. She was walking towards something that belonged to her heart. Inside, the halls echoed with the soft hum of instruments being tuned and the rhythm of piano keys from distant practice rooms. Every sound made her pulse quicken. She had always imagined what it would feel like to study music again, but being there, actually standing among people who lived and breathed it, made her feel both thrilled and terrified. Her first class was in one of the smaller studios. There were about a dozen students all around her age, some even younger. They wore confidence like a second skin, expensive clothes, well-kept instruments, and the easy smiles of people who had never had to fight for opportunities. When the instructor walked in, everyone stood. He was an older man with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Welcome to the beginning of something you may not yet understand," he said in a calm but firm voice. "Here we do not compete with others. We compete with ourselves," the word struck her. Compete with yourself. That was something she understood deeply. The instructor went around asking each student to play a short piece as an introduction. One by one, they performed with practiced skill. When it was her turn, she hesitated for a moment, then sat down and began to play the same melody she had used for her audition. Her fingers trembled at first, but the notes soon flowed smoothly, warm and filled with quiet emotion. When she finished, the room was silent. The instructor nodded slowly and said, "That was not perfect, but it was honest. I prefer honesty over perfection." A few students clapped softly, but she could feel some eyes on her, curious, even doubtful. One of the girls whispered something to her friend, and they both smiled faintly. She didn't pay attention, but inside, she felt the sting. Over the next few weeks, she learned that being talented wasn't always enough. Many of her classmates came from wealthy families trained by private tutors since childhood. They played fast, flawlessly, and spoke about music theory like it was a second language. She often stayed behind after class, practicing late into the night, sometimes until her hands ached. She lived simply. A small rented room near the conservatory, a few meals a day and long hours of study, but every note she played reminded her of why she was there. One evening, after class, the instructor found her still sitting at the piano, her head bent low as she repeated the same piece again and again. "You'll wear the keys out," he said with a faint smile. She looked up quickly, embarrassed. "I just need to get this part right," she said softly. He walked closer, standing beside her. "Do you know what your greatest strength is?" he asked. She shook her head. "You play from life," he said. "Most of these students play from memory. You play from somewhere deeper. Don't lose that trying to sound like them." His words settled deep inside her. She thanked him quietly, and after he left, she smiled to herself for the first time that week. Still, not everyone at the conservatory shared the same kindness. There was one student in particular, a confident young man who always seemed eager to prove his superiority. He often made subtle remarks about her background. "Working in a restaurant before this, right?" he'd say with a grin. "You must have a good ear for background music." She never replied. She simply smiled politely and focused on her work. Deep down, she knew that the best answer wasn't words, it was music. As months passed, her skill grew stronger. She began to understand the techniques she had once struggled with. The melodies she played carried more control now, but still held the emotion that made her different. Slowly, she earned the respect of some of her classmates. Though others still underestimated her, one afternoon, the head of the conservatory announced a major event, the annual performance night, where selected students would play before a large audience, including music critics, donors, and professionals from around the country. It was the kind of opportunity that could change a student's future. The moment she heard about it, she felt her heart skip. She knew this could be her chance to show what she was truly capable of. But there was pressure too. Only a few would be chosen, and the competition was intense. For the next few weeks, the entire conservatory buzzed with preparation. Everyone practiced tirelessly, including her. She spent every free minute at the piano, shaping her piece into something that spoke her truth. Sometimes she thought about the billionaire, how he had helped her reach this point. He hadn't contacted her since her admission, but she often wondered if he remembered her. She promised herself that if she ever got the chance to perform on a big stage, she wanted him to be there to hear it. Finally, the day of the audition for the performance night arrived. She walked into the rehearsal hall with her sheet music in hand, her palms slightly sweaty. The panel of instructors sat quietly at the front. Each student had only 5 minutes to prove themselves. When it was her turn, she sat down, closed her eyes, and took a slow breath. She didn't think about the audience or the judges, and only the music. The melody that came out was soft at first, like a whisper, then rose into a rich emotional flow. It wasn't loud or showy, but it carried a quiet power that filled the room. When she finished, there was a moment of silence before one of the instructors said, "Thank you." She walked out without knowing whether she had impressed them or not. The next morning, the list was posted on the bulletin board. Her eyes scanned the paper nervously, and there it was. Her name. She was chosen. She stood frozen for a second, then covered her mouth, trying to hold back tears. Around her, other students congratulated one another, and a few looked surprised that she had made it. That evening, she sat by the piano in her small room, staring at the keys. She whispered to herself, "You did it, Mama. You really did it." Weeks of rehearsal followed. The performance was scheduled in a grand hall downtown, with hundreds of guests expected to attend. She worked harder than ever, determined to give everything she had. When the night finally came, she stood backstage, dressed in a simple but elegant gown provided by the conservatory. The lights on stage were bright, and the murmurs of the audience filled the air. Her heart pounded so loudly she thought everyone could hear it. As she peeked through the curtain, her eyes stopped on someone sitting in the front row. The billionaire. He was there, watching quietly, his expression calm but attentive. She didn't know how he found out, but seeing him there made her chest tighten with emotion. When her turn came, she walked onto the stage slowly. The spotlight followed her. For a brief second, she froze, but then she remembered the words of her teacher. "Don't lose your honesty." She sat down, placed her fingers on the keys, and began to play. The melody flowed like a story of hardship, loss, courage, and hope. Each note told a piece of her journey. The girl who once worked in silence, the night she was laughed at, the moment she found her voice again. The audience was completely still. Even the billionaire who had once mocked her now sat with his head slightly bowed, listening deeply. When she finished, the last note lingered in the air before fading into silence. Then came the sound of applause. Slow at first, then louder, then a standing ovation. People were wiping their eyes. The instructor who had believed in her smiled proudly from the side of the stage. She stood, bowed her head, and smiled through her tears. Later that night, after the show ended, she walked outside into the cool air, still trembling from the emotion of it all. The billionaire approached her quietly. "You did more than play music tonight," he said softly. "You told a story that everyone needed to hear, including me." She smiled faintly. "You were the reason it started," she said. He shook his head. "No, you were. I just happened to be there when you decided to rise." She looked up at the night sky, filled with stars, and felt peace settle over her. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't thinking about what she'd lost, only about everything she had gained. That night, as she walked home, she hummed the same tune she had played. It wasn't just music anymore. It was her voice, her strength, and her story, one that had started with humiliation but ended with hope. And somewhere in that city, the sound of her melody still lingered in the air, a reminder that even when the world tries to silence you, the heart always finds a way to sing again. The morning after the performance felt unreal. She woke up to the faint glow of sunlight peeking through the thin curtains of her small apartment. For a few moments, she just lay there listening to the quiet. The applause from last night still echoed faintly in her mind, like waves slowly rolling back to the shore. She smiled, still unsure if it had all really happened. When she finally reached for her phone, she noticed something unusual. Dozens of messages, missed calls, and notifications lit up her screen. Some were from classmates congratulating her, others from people she didn't even know. A few messages were from local reporters asking for interviews. For a moment, she didn't know how to react. She had spent so many years living unnoticed that the sudden attention felt both exciting and overwhelming. Later that morning, she went to the conservatory as usual, but something had changed. People stopped her in the hallway to say they loved her performance. A few of the same students who once looked down on her now smiled politely, some even with genuine admiration. The instructor who had guided her patted her shoulder gently and said, "I told you. Honesty in music always finds its way to people's hearts." She thanked him, still humbled. But part of her couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was beginning, something she wasn't entirely ready for. In the following days, clips of her performance spread online. Someone from the audience had recorded her playing and shared it on social media, and soon people all over the city were talking about her. The comments poured in. People praised her emotion, her story, her courage. Some even said her music made them cry. It wasn't fame that excited her. It was knowing that her music had touched people. She had played to survive once, but now she was playing to heal, not just herself, but others. One afternoon, she received a call from an unknown number. She hesitated but answered. A calm, familiar voice spoke on the other end. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." She recognized it immediately. The billionaire. She sat up straighter, unsure what to say. "Oh, no, not at all," she replied nervously. "I was at the concert," he said softly. "Your performance, it was extraordinary." "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He paused for a moment before continuing. "I've been thinking about what I saw that night. You reminded me that talent can't be bought, and pride can blind even those who have everything. I owe you an apology for how I treated you that day." She was quiet for a few seconds, feeling a mix of emotions. "You don't owe me anything," she said gently. "That moment, it pushed me to become who I am today. Maybe I needed it." He let out a slow sigh. "Still, I want to make things right. Would you allow me to meet you for coffee tomorrow?" She agreed, though she wasn't sure why. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe she wanted closure. The next day, she met him at a quiet cafe overlooking the park. He looked different, less rigid, less proud. There was a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said, smiling faintly. "I thought you might turn me down." "I almost did," she admitted. "But I wanted to hear what you had to say." He nodded. "That's fair." For a while, they talked about music, about life, about how strange it was that their paths had crossed again. He told her about his company, how his days were filled with meetings, numbers, and noise. "It's funny," he said quietly. "All the wealth in the world, and yet I realized last night that I've never really listened to a song the way I listened to yours." She smiled softly. "Music does that. It reminds you what silence feels like." They both laughed quietly, The tension between them melted away, replaced by something more genuine: respect. Before leaving, he said, "If you ever need help with your career, anything at all, just call me. I mean it. Not as a favor, but because I believe in what you're doing." She thanked him but didn't promise anything. She had learned not to depend on anyone's charity again. Weeks turned into months and her life began to change. She started receiving invitations to perform at small events, local galleries, cultural festivals, even private gatherings. Each performance brought new faces and new opportunities. She didn't earn much, but she earned something far more valuable: recognition. One evening, after a performance at a small theater, an older woman approached her. "Your music reminds me of my late daughter," she said with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for bringing her memory back even for a moment." Those words stayed with her longer than any applause. The billionaire kept his distance, but every now and then she would get a message from his assistant: donations made to the conservatory, funds to support underprivileged students. She suspected he was doing it quietly because of her. It was his way of giving back without drawing attention. Meanwhile, the media began to take interest in her story. They called her the girl who silenced the billionaire, but she didn't like that label. To her, it wasn't about revenge, it was about growth. One day, she was invited to perform at a charity gala. When she arrived, she realized it was hosted by his company. The hall was filled with elegant people in suits and gowns, chandeliers sparkling above their heads. She felt slightly out of place, dressed simply as always, but she carried herself with quiet confidence. When she walked onto the stage, the billionaire was among the guests. Their eyes met briefly before she sat down at the piano. The audience hushed and she began to play a new piece, one she had written herself. It was inspired by her journey from the restaurant to the conservatory, from shame to strength. The notes rose and fell like memories being reborn. When the final chord faded, the hall erupted in applause. Even the billionaire stood, clapping with genuine admiration. After the performance, he approached her backstage. "You keep proving me wrong," he said with a small laugh. She smiled. "That's not my goal. I just want to keep playing." He looked at her thoughtfully. "Then promise me something," he said. "Promise you won't stop. The world needs people like you, people who remind us what real art feels like." "I promise," she said simply. That night, as she walked home, she thought about how far she had come. She wasn't rich and her life was still full of challenges, but she felt something that money could never buy: peace. She had turned pain into music, humiliation into purpose. In the following months, she began teaching part-time at the conservatory. Her students loved her patience and warmth. She often told them, "Don't play to impress, play to express." Some days she still doubted herself, but each time she sat at the piano, her doubts faded into the sound of her music. The billionaire continued to appear in her life now and then, not as a benefactor, but as a quiet supporter. He attended her recitals, sometimes anonymously. People noticed how his demeanor had changed too. He had started funding music programs for children who couldn't afford instruments. It seemed her influence had softened something inside him. One afternoon, while visiting a school for underprivileged kids where she volunteered, she found him already there, sitting among the children as they clumsily tried to play simple tunes on small keyboards. He looked up and smiled when he saw her. "They're better than I expected," he said. She laughed. "They just need time. Everyone starts somewhere." He watched her for a moment, then said quietly, "You've taught me that." There was something deeply human in that moment. Two people who had once stood on opposite sides of pride and humility, now sharing a simple truth. Months later, she released her first small album. It wasn't flashy or commercial, but it was filled with emotion. The billionaire helped fund its production, but she made sure it was credited only under her name. When it finally launched, people loved it. Her songs played on the radio, in cafes, in people's homes. Her story spread far beyond the city. Not as a tale of revenge, but as proof that kindness, perseverance, and faith in one's passion could outshine arrogance and power. One evening, she stood again on a grand stage, this time not as a student, but as a performer invited to headline the concert. The lights dimmed, the audience quieted, and she began to play the same piece that had changed her life. Among the crowd, the billionaire sat quietly, smiling. He didn't feel pride or guilt anymore, just gratitude that he had witnessed her journey from the beginning. And when the final note echoed through the hall, He stood and clapped with the same sincerity he once lacked. Her eyes met his briefly, and she smiled, not as someone who had won, but as someone who had forgiven. For her, music was never about showing power. It was about finding peace, and for him it was the lesson of a lifetime. That humility, not wealth, defines true greatness. The months after her first album release were filled with quiet miracles. Her music began reaching places she had never imagined. Cafes, radio stations, even small TV shows that featured her as the pianist whose music could make hearts feel again. People would send her messages from all over, telling her how her songs comforted them during hard times. One message came from a man who said he had lost his wife and hadn't touched his piano in years until he heard her play. Another came from a mother who said her daughter with anxiety finally smiled, listening to her song. Every word made her eyes fill with tears. For her, this was more than success. It was connection. Despite the growing attention, she stayed humble. She still lived in her small apartment, still taught her students with the same patience, and still visited the children's school once a week. The billionaire continued to support her quietly, never taking credit for anything. It was clear he had changed. His once arrogant manner had softened into something more grounded. One day, she received a letter from an international music foundation. They had discovered her performance online and wanted to invite her to perform at a grand music festival in Vienna, one of the most prestigious stages in the world. She sat on her bed holding the letter, her hands trembling. It felt almost unreal. That evening, she called the billionaire to tell him the news. When he answered, she could hear genuine excitement in his voice. "You deserve it," he said warmly. "The world needs to hear what I heard that night." She laughed softly. "It's hard to believe. I never thought life would take me this far." "It's not luck," he said. "It's your heart leading you here." The following weeks were a blur of preparation. She spent long hours rehearsing, choosing pieces that represented her journey, the struggles, the hope, and the quiet strength she had discovered along the way. Her students cheered for her every day, and her instructor at the conservatory told her, "This is your time. Play like you're telling your story to the stars." Finally, the day of her departure arrived. The billionaire came to the airport to see her off. He handed her a small box before she boarded. "For good luck," he said. Inside was a simple silver pendant shaped like a piano key. She smiled. "I'll wear it on stage." "Do that," he replied. "And remember, you're not performing for applause. You're performing for your own soul." The flight to Vienna was long, but she barely slept. She spent most of the time staring out of the window, thinking about everything that had led her here. Her parents, her old job at the restaurant, the humiliation, the practice nights, the applause, and the quiet mornings when no one saw her struggle. Every part of it felt like a chapter in the melody of her life. When she arrived, the city took her breath away. The old buildings, the sound of music echoing from street performers, and the soft hum of conversations in different languages. It felt like a dream she had walked into. The festival was being held in a grand concert hall, known for hosting the greatest musicians in history. On the day of the performance, she stood backstage, her heart racing. Around her, other performers tuned their instruments and whispered to each other nervously. She could hear the low murmur of the audience outside, critics, artists, and lovers of music from all over the world. As she waited for her turn, she thought of the billionaire back home. He had sent her a short message earlier. "Play from the heart. That's all you need." When the announcer called her name, she took a deep breath and walked toward the stage. The lights were bright and the silence was heavy. She bowed politely and sat at the grand piano in the center. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a moment. Then she began. The music started softly, a tender melody that spoke of beginnings. Each note carried the warmth of her childhood, the struggles she had faced, the tears she had shed. The middle of the piece grew stronger, a storm of emotion reflecting the years of pain and doubt. And as it reached the end, the sound softened again, like the calm after a storm, filled with peace and quiet gratitude. When the last note faded, there was silence. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then came the sound of applause, not loud at first, but deep and heartfelt. People stood, clapping, cheering, some even wiping their eyes. She bowed her head, her chest tight with emotion. She had done it, not to prove herself, but to share her truth. Later that night, after the event, reporters wanted to interview her. They asked how it felt to perform on such a grand stage, to win over an audience like that. She smiled humbly and said, "Music isn't about being seen. It's about being felt. If someone's heart listened tonight, then I've already succeeded." Her performance became the talk of the festival. Critics called her the soul pianist. Invitations started coming from other countries, but all she wanted was to go home for a while, to return to the place where her journey began. When she finally returned, the billionaire was waiting at the airport again. This time she ran up and hugged him. "You did it," he said, smiling. "You didn't just make music, you made history." She laughed, still overwhelmed. "You were part of it too." "Only as an audience," he replied softly. "The rest was all you." They drove through the city together, the lights of the buildings reflecting in the car windows. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then he said, "You know, that night at the restaurant, when I tried to embarrass you, I thought I was teaching you a lesson, but you were the one who taught me instead." She looked at him quietly. "What lesson?" "That money can buy a stage, but not the heart to stand on it." She smiled, and for a while they both sat in silence, just listening to the faint hum of the road. In the following years, her life continued to bloom. She started her own foundation to provide instruments and free lessons to children who couldn't afford them. She called it the Melody of Hope. The Billionaire became one of its first sponsors, but he never let anyone know his involvement. He didn't need credit anymore. Together, they organized annual concerts where her students performed. The first time she saw one of her young students play in front of a crowd, her eyes filled with tears. It reminded her of the girl she once was, standing alone, trembling before a piano, not knowing the world was about to change for her. As time went on, she released more albums, each one filled with emotion and truth. Her music reached millions, yet she never lost the warmth that had guided her from the beginning. She lived simply, visited her students often, and never let fame distance her from real life. One evening, years later, she visited the same restaurant where everything had started. It had been renovated, brighter now, but the piano was still there. The manager recognized her immediately and invited her to play a tune. She smiled, sat down at the same spot, and began to play softly. The melody was calm and full of peace, and a circle completed. People around stopped eating to listen, the same way they once had, but this time the room was filled not with judgment, but admiration. As she finished, the room erupted into applause. She stood, bowed gently, and walked out into the cool night. The city lights shimmered on the streets, and she felt the quiet joy of a journey fulfilled. Later that night, she sat by her window at home, the piano key pendant still hanging around her neck. She thought of all the faces she had met, all the moments that had shaped her, and smiled. Her life had begun with humiliation and pain, but it had transformed into something beautiful, something meaningful. And deep inside, she knew that none of it would have happened if she hadn't believed in herself that day. As the night grew darker, she whispered to herself, "Every story has music in it. You just have to listen closely enough." And somewhere across the city, in a quiet room filled with the faint sound of a piano, the billionaire sat alone, listening to one of her recordings. He closed his eyes and smiled. For him, her music was more than sound. It was redemption, forgiveness, and a reminder that even the proudest hearts could change. Her melody lived on, not just in the world's grand halls or on music charts, but in the quiet hearts of those who once thought their dreams had ended. And for as long as her fingers touched the keys, her story would keep playing, a song of grace, courage, and the endless strength of the human spirit.